Thank you, Mohammed. So I have prepared I guess it's about a 12, 15-minute speech. Is that okay if I can go and I will cover all of those things? Or do you want me, or do you want me to respond to your questions right now, or can I go into my opening remark?
Okay.
Okay. All right. So thank you, Mohammed. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of you joining us from across the globe. I want to thank MAAT for Peace, Development, and Human Rights, and also its division, the International Humanitarian Law and Disarmament, for the invitation to speak on an issue that rarely gets any attention: the irresponsible export of arms to Ethiopia and illegal use of these arms against civilians by the Ethiopian military. This is an important topic that I'm really glad that MAAT has decided to hold a discussion, and really looking forward to hear what everyone what all the panelists have to say about this. Since the selection of Abiy Ahmed Ali as Prime Minister of Ethiopia in 2018, and please do not let the name confuse you, even though he may have an Arabic name, he's actually a Protestant Christian. Ethiopia, since Abiy Ahmed has come into power, has been embroiled in several civil wars, near economic collapse, really instability across the entire country, millions of Ethiopians facing food insecurity, and also self-inflicted strife with its neighbors, such as Somalia and Eritrea. The common denominator in the internal instability and external instability in the Horn of Africa is Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed and his Oromo Prosperity Party. The Tigray People's Liberation Front, also known as TPLF, also shares some of the blame, as they started the civil war in November of 2020, and until 2018 had been in power in Ethiopia for nearly 30 years. In order to explain the current war on the Amhara people by Prime Minister Abiy, I have to provide a little bit of historical context. In 2018, the dominant party in Ethiopia, the Tigray People's Liberation Front, or TPLF, had ruled Ethiopia for nearly 30 years. It was removed from power after popular uprising from Amhara and Oromo youth that was largely grassroots led. Additionally, diaspora organizations, especially in the US, such as the organization I represent, the Amhara Association of America, lobbied extensively to put pressure on the TPLF by introducing and passing legislation. The political elites, without consultation with the Ethiopian public, transferred power to what is now the Oromo Prosperity Party from the TPLF, and selected Abiy as the prime minister. Abiy Ahmed allowed banned political parties and armed groups to return to the country. One of these political parties was the Oromo Liberation Front and their armed wing, the Oromo Liberation Army, that has a long history of committing war crimes and crimes against humanity against the Amhara people. The OLF and OLA were allowed to return to Ethiopia into the Oromia region with their arms. They were not disarmed when they entered, but they were allowed to recruit, train, and radicalize young Oromo youth. Since 2019, the Oromo Liberation Army and the Oromia Special Forces, which is an arm of the Oromia region, basically an arm of the government, has committed hundreds of massacres against Amhara civilians, committed tortures, and ethnically cleansed over 2 million Amharas from the Oromia region. AAA has documentation to prove that what transpired in Oromia region against Amhara civilians under Abiy Ahmed amounts to a genocide. Some of the massacres and crimes committed are of such horrific scale that your sense of humanity is challenged. For example, in June 18 of 2022, over 554 Amhara civilians were massacred in a single day. Over 48 Amharas were massacred on the holy grounds of the Jafar Mosque. So imagine being massacred in a mosque where these civilians are going there to seek refuge, from their God, but instead, they're massacred. As these killings were committed by the OLA and government forces, Abiy Ahmed is directly responsible and should be held accountable. The TPLF did not accept losing power in 2018 did not accept losing this power and returned to the capital of Tigray region and began to plot a return to power. The TPLF did the same as the OLF and the OLA did by openly recruiting, arming, and building their forces in their region. This war preparation was done openly. It was very visible. The war rhetoric between the TPLF leadership and the Abiy Ahmed government continued to escalate until multiple red lines were crossed. On November 30th, 2022, the TPLF forces attacked the northern command of the Ethiopian National Defense Forces. In addition to attacking the Ethiopian National Defense Forces and killing hundreds and also taking hundreds more as captive, the TPLF also invaded the Amhara and Afar regions. Many outside observers and analysts were alarmed that war had ensued between these two parties. However, for Ethiopians, it was very clear and easy to see that war was imminent. And we had warned the international institutions and the US government to intervene quickly before a war ensued. But as most of you know, usually international institutions are reactionary. They rarely do anything that is proactive to prevent a war. The TPLF could not envision an Ethiopia where they did not control the political, economic, and military apparatus, as they had done so for nearly 30 years. And Abiy Ahmed and his Oromo prosperity had the same aspiration and ambition as the TPLF. In the same way that the TPLF established Tigray hegemony, Abiy Ahmed and his Oromo Prosperity Party were attempting to establish Oromo hegemony in their country. The deadliest single-day massacre was committed by the TPLF on November 9, 2020, when over 1,500 Amhara civilians were massacred. Imagine over 1,500 people being killed in a single day. Many were killed in their homes by militias using machetes, knives, and guns. The perpetrators escaped to Sudan or their home region of Tigray. The TPLF invaded the Amhara region on multiple occasions during the war in northern Ethiopia and committed gross human rights violations that amount to crimes against humanity. The TPLF had occupied most of Wollo for about 6 months and other areas within Amhara region spanning from a few days to a few months, committing many massacres. During the TPLF's occupation, hundreds of massacres were committed, thousands of rapes were committed against children as young as 5 and the elderly, displacement of millions of civilians. Additionally, the TPLF destroyed civilian infrastructure such as schools, hospitals, homes, destroyed crops, and looted food, medicine, and cattle. During this horrendous occupation, the Ethiopian government under Abiy Ahmed would cut off internet, so the crimes were being committed in the dark. The Amharas were forced to organize and defend themselves because it became a matter of survival. The Amharas established Fano defense forces across Amhara region. Fano is a historical way Amhara civilians organize against foreign invaders to defend their community and country. Unfortunately, in this instance, the Fanos were defending themselves against the state, the Ethiopian government, and also internal forces such as the TPLF and the OLA. For 2 years, the war in northern Ethiopia saw some of the most gruesome atrocities against civilian Amharas, Afar, and Tigrayans. Hundreds of thousands of lives were lost, billions of dollars worth of civilian infrastructure damage, and millions of people left to fend for themselves as the social and state structure had failed them. Sadly, perpetrators of this gruesome war have yet to be held accountable. But after this the heroic battle by the Fanos, the TPLF was removed from Amhara region in 2022. Eventually, after losing the cities in Tigray, except for the capital, and immense pressure from the international community, the TPLF and Abiy regime agreed to negotiate. However, the cessation of hostilities agreement, also known as the Pretoria Agreement, was a flawed process that excluded the Amhara people from the negotiation, though the Amharas had prepared a negotiation delegation to participate. The Pretoria Agreement was a failure. It excluded key actors such as Amharas, Afars, including the Eritrean government. It was essentially a war pact between the TPLF and the Abiy regime, now that the TPLF was defeated, against the Amhara people. It did not bring about the lasting peace or silence the guns. The war in Amhara region continued. After the Pretoria Agreement, the Abiy government turned its guns against the Amhara people. In July of 2023, the Abiy military sent thousands of forces into the Amhara region to disarm the Amhara Special Forces and also the Fanos. A state of emergency was declared in August of 2023. The internet has been shut down since August of 2023. Nearly 30 million people in the Amhara region are without any internet, and oftentimes even mobile lines and landlines are cut when atrocities are being committed. Rape has been weaponized by the military. Majority of the hospitals have been shut down or destroyed. There's no medicine. Nurses have been killed, intimidated. Nearly 3 million Amhara children are not attending schools. Amhara journalists, opposition politicians, and activists have been jailed and tortured by the Ethiopian government. However, after nearly a year of fighting, the Fanos control about 90% of the rural region, with the military only controlling a few of the big cities. The Abiy regime has used heavy artillery and tanks to shell civilians, have used fighter jets and military-grade machine guns. These tanks and heavy artillery have been used against schools, hospitals, churches, and unfortunately mosques as well. AAA has documented over 44 drone attacks since August 2023, killing hundreds of civilians and injuring hundreds more. Drones have been used extensively by this government. I invite you to go to our website to look at the reports. You may be wondering, where is the Abiy government getting these drones, the tanks, and other weapons? The Abiy government has been receiving economic and military assistance primarily from the United Arab Emirates. The UAE has funneled billions in grants and loans to the Abiy government to prop up the regime. The UAE has also been the source of drones and other military hardware. Amharas have tracked military flights from the UAE to Addis Ababa to restock Abiy's genocidal military. Last year, the UAE and the Ethiopian Air Force held a joint air force. The Abiy government has also been purchasing large amounts of drones from Turkey's Bayraktar and has been used deadly against Amhara civilians. In addition, the Ethiopian government has been purchasing weapons from China, Israel, other technologies, and other foreign governments as well. Governments and the international institutions have failed to curb the irresponsible and immoral arms transferred to the Abiy regime, which is being used to commit a genocide. Though it is well known that these weapons are being used to commit war crimes, crimes against humanity, the international community has largely ignored Abiy's war on the Amhara people. Due to the current geopolitics in the region and globally, the superpowers and middle powers now in the Gulf and other countries are willing to overlook a genocide to secure their national interest. And international institutions such as the African Union and the UN are influenced by these same powers, thus they're silent. The African Union has many mechanisms to hold countries such as Ethiopia accountable, as well as the UN. And Mohammed, let me know. I'm almost done, but I can stop and cover some of these things and do questions and answers.
No, take your time. We have a question for you.
Okay. Okay, thank you. The African Union can put political pressure on Ethiopia by condemning the human rights violations committed by the Abiy government. In line with Article 9 and 10 of the Peace and Security Protocol, the Council can hold emergency and regular meetings, and they should be doing this. Demand and conduct investigations through the African Commission on People and Human Rights. The African Union can call out countries such as the UAE, Turkey, Israel, and others for supplying weapons to the Abiy regime, and other legal instruments can be used to hold the Abiy government accountable. Unfortunately, it is civic organizations such as ours that are using the legal mechanisms in an attempt to bring attention to the humanitarian crisis. My organization, the Amhara Association of America, along with the Center for Human Rights at the University of Pretoria, filed a legal complaint in February of 2023 with the African Commission on People and Human Rights, which is a body within the African Union, on behalf of thousands of Amhara civilians killed and millions displaced in the Oromia region. Unfortunately, this is a long process and the victims have yet to receive justice. Many of you know that the ACHPR process is very long and daunting. Similarly, we have seen the United Nations largely remain silent regarding the crisis Amharas are facing and the overall instability of the country. The UN has many tools at its disposal to hold the Ethiopian government accountable and the countries that supply the Ethiopian government with weapons. The UN can hold hearings at the UN Security Council, focus discussion at the UN Human Rights Council, establish independent commissions to conduct independent investigations, and hold member countries for providing weapons to the government accountable. The fact that the Amhara region, with a population of 30 million, has been suffering for nearly a year under a complete internet shutdown, and the AU and the UN have been silent, shows that the AU and UN do not center human rights and good governance at their core. In September of 2021, by Executive Order 14046, President Biden declared a national emergency through the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. The executive order was extended in September of 2023, which is a recognition on the war in Amhara and the overall instability in the country. The Department of Homeland Security designated Ethiopia for temporary protective status in December of 2022. This designation was extended in April of this year for another 18 months because of the war on Amhara. TPS allows Ethiopian citizens to remain in the US instead of being forced to return to their country during a time of war. Though this relief is appreciated, little else has been done to hold the Ethiopian government accountable, the TPLF or the OLA accountable, nor any pressure has been put on the countries that provide weapons to the Ethiopian government. When Executive Order 14046 was signed in 2021, only Eritrean entities and individuals were sanctioned by the Biden administrations, which is a disappointment. The Ethiopian government is mainly responsible for the war crimes and crimes against humanity against the Ethiopian people. The government, and the individuals responsible should be sanctioned by the United States as well as international institutions such as the UN. The Amhara people were forced to defend themselves because the state became the main actor in committing a genocide, and international institutions failed to intervene. Ethiopia is a country of nearly 115 million, and for all intents and purposes, it's a failed state. Sudan is facing a brutal civil war with no end in sight. Somalia is facing a precarious situation, and we have observed the conflict instigated by the Abiy regime between Somalia and Somaliland. And South Sudan is facing a humanitarian and political crisis. Essentially, the Horn of Africa, with a population of nearly 150 million, is in a serious jeopardy that can affect the entirety of the African continent, Middle East, and Europe. It is critical for all stakeholders to Ethiopia to intervene and avoid what could end up being the largest humanitarian crisis in the 21st century. We can move the trajectory of violence towards, we can move this trajectory towards ending the cycle of violence, not just against the Amhara people, but all communities in Ethiopia, if there is real attempt at addressing the structural and systemic causes of the conflict, support a true all-inclusive national dialogue, and a transitional justice that is a victim-focused, holding perpetrators accountable. Thank you, Mohammed.
Yeah, thank you, my friend. Before we take the question, I have two questions for me, because this is very important in our topic. The first one is I have information confirming that drones killed many civilians in Oromo. Can we access especially information about this? Can we know about this in specifically? And also the second one, if do you have any information about the deals of the bombs or small arms that is Ethiopian government take from another countries and use it in violate human rights or international humanitarian law and in the ground?
Sure. In terms of the arms that are being used, there have been many arms that have been purchased from several countries. And right now, as you all know, Ethiopia is not at war with a foreign country. Ethiopia is at war with itself, and the government is using, military grade machine guns, tanks, heavy artillery, as I said earlier, really primarily against civilian targets. These weapons are coming from multiple sources, mainly from UAE, Turkey. Some of them are also being purchased, from China and other countries as well. But they're primarily being used against civilians. As I said earlier, we have documented over 40 drone attacks in the Amhara region alone. Let me just give you a few examples of how these drones have been used. May has seen one of the most deadliest drone operations with an estimated 7 drone attacks in Wollo and Shua areas of the Amhara region. There's an estimate over 40 that have been killed in these 7 drone attacks. One of the attacks targeted a school in North Wollo during a parents-teacher association meeting. Imagine the shock to the community when parents and educators see, out of school, are targeted by drones. So how could you continue to send your children to school when a school is being, attacked by a drone? In February of this year, a drone attack in North Shua targeted a vehicle returning from a baptismal ceremony, killing over 40. Almost all of them were, family members. Mothers and young children were killed in this attack. In January of this year, the Abiy regime killed over 80 Amhara civilians in a town called Marawi. There was widespread coverage when the military was mainly going door to door, killing innocent civilians, including a mother and her two-year-old infant. In Gondar, in April and May of this year, has seen some of the deadliest violence. Between April 15th and 16th, the military killed over 17 civilians and burned over 18 homes in South Gondar. Between May 4th and 5th, 47 civilians were extrajudicially killed and 20 homes burned. The inhumanity and immorality of the Abiy regime and his genocidal forces is a daily occurrence against Amharas and also other communities. We have seen now drones being used in other areas of Ethiopia as well. And this has really with deadly intent. And the people suffering are innocent people. So, Mohammed, these weapons that the Ethiopian government is purchasing are being used, irresponsibly. The governments that are transferring these weapons are doing so irresponsibly. It is critically important. Civic organizations across the globe not only demand for accountability of the Ethiopian government that is using weapons, but also call out these governments that are transferring these weapons to the Ethiopian government in violation of international humanitarian law. We're taking many avenues here. With regards to the ACHPR, we're continuing to follow up with the CHR, the Center for Human Rights at the University of Pretoria, and trying to move the process along so that finally the Ethiopian government can be held accountable for the crimes it has committed against the Amhara people in Wolega. For those of you who have been involved with the ACHPR process, it's a very long process. But justice oftentimes does not come fast. Other things that we are doing as an organization is we are actively engaged with the United States Trade Representative to prevent Ethiopia from being reinstated into AGOA. AGOA is allows for sub-Saharan African countries to sell goods to the U.S. Really duty-free. And so the Ethiopian government was removed from AGOA. I believe it was in 2021 when President Biden signed the executive order. We have been actively engaging the State Department, the U.S. Congress, and the U.S. Trade Representative, providing evidence that the Ethiopian government is continuing to commit, crimes against humanity and war crimes, and they should not be allowed reinstated back into AGOA. We're also engaging the United Nations as well. In addition to that, we continue to produce investigative reporting of human rights violations and continue to share those reports with all stakeholders, not just governments, but institutions, and also medias that cover Ethiopia. The leaders within our organization rarely are invited on Al Jazeera. We also have been quoted on the New York Times, Reuters, and AP. And really, it's our way of trying to educate the international community at large of what's going on in Ethiopia. And what happens in Ethiopia, as I was saying earlier, a country of nearly 110 million, 115 million people. And then if you take into account also the situation in the Horn with Sudan, South Sudan, Somalia, really the repercussions to the continent, to the Middle East, is very, very concerning. And that's why we try to get all stakeholders to be engaged in a positive way and to really address the structural and systematic issues that Ethiopia that Ethiopia has, because it is really systemic, it is structural, and that's why we are continuing to see this cycle of violence. Just to say a little bit about that, when the TPLF came into power in the early 1990s, they imposed an ethnic apartheid system into the country, dividing the country for the first time along ethnic and linguistic lines. They created basically ethnic regions, linguistic regions. And so then if you move or try to travel outside of your so-called ethnic region, you're almost like a foreigner within your own country. So Amhara's in the millions, that number anywhere between 10 to 20 million, we don't know the exact number, in the Oromia region, cannot vote, cannot hold office, cannot join the military. This is their own country. So they are essentially stateless within their own country. And this is the case in other parts of the regions. And so that's why we are saying that the structural and systemic issues that leads Ethiopia to continuous war must be addressed. And we finally have to have real justice and accountability. When power was transitioned from the TPLF to Abiy Ahmed and the Oromo Prosperity Party, there was no accountability. No one was held accountable while TPLF was in power for nearly 30 years. So, how do you expect people to move on, if these issues are not addressed?
Okay, thank you. I agree with you. That is no accountability in Ethiopia, and we need, as a civil society organization, working on it. We have also a question for you and for Mr. Ayman from our guest, Clear. Thank you, Clear, for your question. It's a very brilliant one. The question is that are you seeing any evidence that the weapons in this era are affected, especially specific parts of the Oromo population, especially women? The floor refuses to address to answer this question, and also after you, Mr. Ayman will also answer answer this question. The floor refuses.
Can you repeat the question so that is clear? I want to make sure I understand it. Yeah.
Are you seeing any evidence that the weapons in the era are affecting specific parts of Oromo population, especially women?
So there are reports. There is active fighting between the military and the Oromo Liberation Army within the Oromia region. So obviously, the same weapons are being used. The same weapons that are being used in the Amhara region and other parts of the country are being used. Now, because of the nature of our work and because of the instability in that part of the country, with regards to the Oromo violence and also the violence between the Ethiopian military and the fighting with the Oromo Liberation Army and how this affects the Oromo civilians, we don't have as much information on that, but there are organizations and also who have been documenting this. So the Oromo civilians obviously are impacted by the fighting that is happening, in that region. But also there are also millions of non-Oromos who live in the Oromia region. As I was saying earlier, there's an estimation between 10 to 15 million Amharas who live in the Oromia region. And many of the fighting that is happening between the ENDF and the OLA occurs in the area where majority of the Amharas live, in the areas of like Walega, and that's where over 2 million Amharas have been ethnically cleansed. So, but the conflict and violence is not just in those two areas. It's also in the southern part of the country, and that rarely gets any attention. So, if you look at alerts that come out from many foreign governments with regards to Ethiopia, they advising their citizens to essentially to not leave the capital. If they try to leave the capital, they're basically telling them, if you leave the capital, you are at risk. Anywhere else in Ethiopia outside of the capital, there's a threat of violence to you. These are alerts that you can see from the Canadian government, the British government, the U.S. State Department, and so we have also observed, essentially what amounts to like inter-regional fighting that we have observed between the Afar region and the Somali region, and the federal government, because it does not have a monopoly of violence, cannot do anything about it. And so when I said earlier, essentially Ethiopia has become a failed state, it's because the government does not have a monopoly of violence. There is no presence really of federal forces in the Tigray region. In the Amhara region, majority of the region is controlled by the Fanos, at least 90% of the rural areas. In many parts of the southern part of the country, the federal government is not present because their troops are in the Amhara region fighting a war. And so, the local forces are being used to try to suppress and oppress the local people there. So it is really a very concerning situation. And that's why, our organization and many organizations like ours are out there sounding the alarm and, asking, institutions such as the AU, the UN, and other institutions to get involved, to get engaged, partnering with, civil institutions such as MAAT and others to collaborate and work together, ensuring that the voices of the victims are not lost. And so you see oftentimes travel to Ethiopia, and when you see these foreign diplomats traveling, they're only in Addis Ababa, and unfortunately, usually they're only speaking to government officials, where we advise them that if you want peace to come to this country, you have to talk to everyone. You have to speak to to everyone, understand their perspective, understand their concerns, take that into consideration when formulating foreign policy. Also, because then they can tell you about how these weapons that the government is purchasing is being used against their own people, against civilians, against their families, against their against their community.